Corbin Valetti wasn't the kind of man who flinched. At 37, he'd built an empire that stretched across Chicago's underbelly real estate on paper, something far darker underneath, and he'd done it with steady hands and a voice that never needed to rise above a whisper to make grown men fall silent. He had 40 armed guards around his Lake Forest estate, and enough hidden cameras to watch every inch of that house around the clock. All of it existed for one reason: his 5-year-old daughter, Noelle. 8 months ago, Corbin's wife was shot and killed right in front of that little girl, and ever since that night, Noelle hadn't spoken a single word. She didn't cry, didn't laugh, didn't look at anyone long enough for them to pretend things were fine. He'd hired 3 nannies in those 8 months. Each one failed. One quit out of fear, another drowned the child in pity, and the last treated her like a checklist: fed, bathed, done, while Noelle sat alone in her room, rocking back and forth, hugging the stuffed bear her mother gave her. Corbin saw all of it through those cameras. Every night, he'd sit in his dark office, replaying footage on a tablet, watching his daughter disappear a little more each day, and he never once walked into her room, because every time he looked at Noelle, he didn't see his daughter. He saw his wife bleeding out in the back seat. He heard the gunshots, and he knew it was his fault. Then one afternoon, while Corbin sat in a room full of dangerous men discussing territory and power, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the security app, expecting nothing. What he saw made the most feared man in Chicago stop mid-sentence. Noelle was on her bedroom floor, and sitting across from her, cross-legged at eye level, there was a young woman he'd never seen before, a delivery girl, with messy hair and a wrinkled uniform, arranging flowers into shapes on the carpet, and talking to his daughter like she was the only person in the world. Noelle wasn't smiling, but she was reaching out. Her tiny fingers were touching a flower petal, and her eyes, those empty eyes that hadn't focused on anything in all those months, were locked onto this stranger's face. Corbin's first instinct wasn't relief. It was the cold, lethal suspicion of a man who'd already lost everything once. Who sent her? He stood up, walked out without a word, and left behind men who could have killed him for the disrespect. He didn't care. All he knew was that a stranger was doing what he, her own father, hadn't been able to do, and he didn't know whether to thank her or destroy her. If this story's already got you hooked, hit that like button so more people can find it, share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe so you won't miss what comes next. Now let's go back to the night everything changed, the night Corbin Valetti lost his wife and his daughter stopped speaking. 8 months earlier, everything was still whole. Corbin Valetti drove the black sedan down the road home, his left hand resting on the steering wheel, his right hand lightly holding his wife's hand on the center armrest between the 2 seats. Penny sat in the passenger seat, wearing the white dress she had chosen, especially for their wedding anniversary dinner, her brown hair falling over her shoulders, the faint scent of her perfume still lingering in the car. In the back, Noelle was dozing in her child seat, her head tilted to one side, her arms wrapped around her stuffed bear, her mouth slightly open. Penny turned around to look at their daughter, smiled softly, then told Corbin that she wanted to take Noelle to the park near Lake Michigan that weekend, that the little girl loved watching the ducks there. Corbin nodded, smiled, and in that brief moment, he believed he could be both Corbin Valetti and an ordinary husband, an ordinary father. The car turned into an empty intersection in Bridgeport. Red light. Corbin stopped. Then headlights from straight ahead blazed through the windshield. A black SUV rushed in and blocked the front of the car. 2 doors opened at the same time, and 2 figures stepped out, their faces covered, guns in their hands. Corbin knew at once. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a robbery. This was a kill order. The instinct of a man who had lived in the shadows rose before the instinct of a father. Corbin reached under the driver's seat for the gun he kept hidden there, but in that split second, Penny acted before he did. She didn't duck down. She didn't scream. She turned toward the back seat, unfastened her seatbelt, and covered Noelle with her entire body. Her back faced the window. 3 shots exploded in a row through the right side window. Glass shattered everywhere. 2 bullets hit Penny. 1 struck her shoulder. 1 entered her back. Her body jerked violently, but she didn't let go of her daughter. Corbin pulled his gun and fired back through the broken window frame. 2 shots. 3 shots. 1 attacker fell onto the road, and the other jumped back into the SUV and sped away as the tires shrieked against the wet asphalt. Then silence. A thick, suffocating silence that was more terrifying than the gunfire. Corbin turned toward the passenger seat and called Penny's name. There was no answer. She had collapsed into the back seat, half her body lying over Noelle, blood soaking through the white dress and spreading in darker and darker stains across the leather cushion. Her hand was still holding their daughter, her fingers clenched into Noelle's shirt as if even in death, she still refused to let go. Noelle opened her eyes. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She only looked at her mother with wide, silent eyes, and from that moment on, not a single sound ever came out of her mouth again. Penny didn't survive the ride to the hospital. Corbin sat in the emergency room, his wife's blood still on his hands, and he knew better than anyone that those bullets hadn't been meant for Penny. They had been meant for him. This was Omar Segretti's order, the rival boss who had wanted Corbin dead for a long time, but who had killed the wrong person, the only person who made Corbin want to live. The funeral took place in the rain. White flowers, an oak coffin, awkward embraces from acquaintances whose faces Corbin couldn't even remember. He stood beside his wife's grave, his face cold as stone, not shedding a single tear in front of anyone. But inside him, something had died with Penny. In the weeks that followed, Corbin took revenge. Brutal, systematic, merciless. Segretti's network was broken apart link by link. Segretti's men disappeared one by one, but Segretti himself escaped. The old man vanished from Chicago like a shadow, leaving behind a wordless threat that this wasn't over. And Corbin turned the Lake Forest mansion into a fortress. 40 armed bodyguards worked in shifts 24 hours a day. 28 hidden cameras were placed in every corner of the house. Steel gates, electronic fences, armored cars parked in the garage. Noelle lived among all of it. Absolutely safe, in the way a child should never have to be safe. Inside a house that had everything except laughter, everything except a mother, everything except a father brave enough to step into his own child's room. While Noelle was living inside that silent fortress, more than 20 miles to the south, a 27-year-old girl named Sadie Brennan was loading buckets of fresh flowers into the old van parked in front of Walt's Blooms in Lincoln Square. The shop was small, its blue-painted storefront peeling, its wooden sign hanging slightly crooked. But inside, it was always full of the scent of fresh flowers and the sound of old songs playing on the radio. Sadie worked there from 4 in the morning until noon, delivering flowers to wealthy families in the North Shore and Gold Coast, neighborhoods she could never afford to step into as a resident. In the afternoon, she helped in the kitchen at a small diner near Wrigleyville. At night, she cleaned offices for an insurance company downtown. 3 jobs, 7 days a week, and it still wasn't enough to pay off the medical debt her mother had left behind 18 years earlier. Sadie's mother had died of cancer when Sadie was 9. Not the kind of cancer that kills quickly, but the kind that stretches on, wearing a person down day by day, week by week, while the cost of medicine piles up into a mountain of debt that a family without health insurance could never repay. After her mother died, Sadie stayed with her stepfather, a man who drank more than he spoke, and spoke with his fists more than with words. For 8 years, Sadie learned how to read the sound of footsteps on the stairs to know whether that night would be safe or not, learned how to cover bruises with long sleeves in the middle of summer, learned how to become invisible in order to survive. At 17, she ran away from home with a backpack and $42. She slept in cars, in shelters, on benches at subway stations, and did any job anyone would hire her to do. She never went to college. She had no best friend, no boyfriend, no one who called on her birthday. Her rented room in Uptown was barely large enough for a single bed and a small wardrobe, with walls so thin she could hear the television next door, and every month she had to choose between paying the electric bill on time or buying enough food for the final week. The only person who treated Sadie like family was Walt, the owner of the flower shop, 64 years old, a veteran, gray-haired, slightly stooped, his hands calloused from cutting flowers every day for 30 years. Walt never asked Sadie about her past. He simply left half a sandwich on the counter every morning when she arrived, poured her black coffee because he knew she liked it that way, and whenever she messed up an order, he only shook his head, smiled, and told her to do it again. He was the closest thing to a father Sadie had ever had. The Valetti mansion was one of their regular weekly delivery stops. Fresh flowers, a large order, paid on time, never any contact with the homeowner. A guard received the delivery at the gate, signed for it, and that was it. Sadie didn't think much about that house until one morning, when the mansion gate opened to let a maintenance vehicle drive out, and through the narrowing gap as the gate began to close, Sadie caught sight of something that made her hand stop halfway through its motion. A little girl was sitting on a ground floor windowsill, her face pressed against the glass, her eyes looking outside but not really looking at anything. Those eyes were empty, distant, as if the child had been inside that room for so long she had forgotten there was still a world beyond it. Sadie recognized that look instantly, not because she had studied it in books or seen it in movies, but because she had once seen that very look in the mirror, every morning, for 8 years in her stepfather's house. The look of a child who had given up. On the next delivery, Sadie tucked in one small wildflower that wasn't part of the order, a white daisy growing by the roadside near the shop, and asked the guard at the gate to give it to the little girl at the window. The guard looked at her strangely, but he took it anyway. The following week, when Sadie came back, she looked up at the ground floor window and saw that wildflower placed on the windowsill beside the glass, wilted, but still there. From then on, every time she made a delivery, Sadie tucked in one extra flower. Chamomile, lavender, daisy, whatever she could find. And little by little, she noticed a small change. The little girl began appearing at the window right when Sadie's van pulled up in front of the gate. She didn't smile. She didn't wave. But she was there. She was waiting. It happened on a Tuesday morning, about 3 weeks after the first time Sadie had sent the wildflower through the gate. That day, Nina, the nanny looking after Noelle, had to go out to buy medicine prescribed for the little girl by the doctor. At the same time, the guard on duty at the main gate was busy checking a strange car that had been parked near the mansion since early morning, the kind of thing no one in the Valetti household dared to take lightly. When Sadie arrived to deliver the regular flower order, no one was there at the gate to receive it as usual. Another guard came out from inside, looked at her, looked at the order, then led her into the kitchen so she could set the flowers down directly instead of leaving them outside the gate. It was the first time Sadie had ever stepped inside the Valetti mansion. She placed the buckets of flowers on the marble counter, her eyes moving over a kitchen larger than her rented room in Uptown. Everything expensive and cold, without a single trace that a child lived in this house, no drawings stuck to the refrigerator, no colorful plastic cups, no cookie crumbs on the floor. Sadie was arranging the flowers in a vase when she heard a soft sound by the kitchen doorway. She turned around. Noelle was standing there. The little girl wore cream-colored pajamas, her hair messy, her bare feet on the cold tile floor. She was standing, and that detail, which Sadie couldn't have known at the time, mattered more than anything else. Noelle hadn't been willing to stand up on her own or walk for months. The doctors called it a trauma-induced motor disorder. Her body was entirely capable of walking, but her mind refused, as if her legs had frozen along with the night her mother collapsed in the back seat of that car. But that morning, she had stood up. She had dragged herself step by slow step from the living room to the kitchen, holding onto the wall, to the edge of the doorway, trembling but determined, only because she had heard the voice of the person who sent her flowers. Sadie looked at her. The little girl looked back. Neither of them said anything for a few seconds. Then Sadie did something no nanny before her had ever done. She didn't step closer to the child. She didn't bend down over her from above. She sat down on the cold kitchen floor, right where she was, folded her legs beneath her, and put herself at eye level with the child standing in the doorway. Then she took a white daisy from the flower bucket, placed it on her open palm, and said in the most ordinary voice she could, without pity, without false sweetness, just the voice of one person speaking to another person, "I brought daisies today. Would you like to smell one?" Noelle didn't answer, but she took one more step, then another. Slowly, hesitantly, as if every step was a decision she had to fight herself to make. She stopped about an arm's length from Sadie, looked at the flower, then looked up at Sadie's face, and she reached out to touch the petals. Gently, as if she was afraid it would disappear. Sadie didn't cheer. She didn't praise her. She didn't do anything that might break the moment open. She only held the flower in her hand, kept the same small smile on her face, and let Noelle touch it for as long as the little girl wanted. On the next delivery, Sadie was led into the kitchen again, because Nina was busy feeding the child lunch upstairs, and Noelle appeared in the kitchen doorway again. This time, she came faster, her steps steadier, and when Sadie sat down on the floor, the little girl sat down too, across from her, with a small space between them. The third time, Noelle was already sitting in the kitchen before Sadie arrived, as if she knew the flower delivery schedule more precisely than anyone else in the house. Sadie sat on the floor and told Noelle about Walt, about how the old man once mistakenly cut a rare batch of imported tulips thinking they were local daisies because he mislaid his reading glasses, about a nervous young man who bought a single rose every morning just to catch a glimpse of the bakery girl next door, and about a stray cat that ruled the storefront, whom Walt swore he detested but secretly provided with the premium tuna. Sadie talked and arranged flowers on the floor into simple shapes, one flower beside another, into a star, a sun, a butterfly. Noelle didn't speak. She didn't smile. But she watched. She listened. And she didn't leave. For a child who had shut the world out for months, choosing to stay beside someone was the greatest thing she could do. And this was the very afternoon Corbin Valetti saw through his phone screen, in the middle of a room full of dangerous men, and decided to abandon everything and rush home. Finch's phone rang just as Corbin was threading the car through the heavy traffic on Lakeshore Drive. Sadie Brennan, 27 years old, delivery worker for Waltz Bloom's flower shop in Lincoln Square. No criminal record, no prior offenses, no ties to any organization, no connection to Segretti, no connection to anyone at all. Clean, boss. Corbin said nothing. He ended the call, threw the phone onto the passenger seat, and pressed harder on the gas. Clean didn't mean safe. In Corbin's world, the cleanest surfaces often hid the filthiest things, and even if she really was only a flower delivery girl, that still didn't explain why she was sitting on the floor of his daughter's room as if she belonged there. Corbin reached the mansion in less than 40 minutes, a trip that should have taken more than 1 hour during Chicago rush hour. He didn't enter the house through the front door. He took the side entrance, moved quickly down the hallway, and went up the stairs to the ground floor, where Noelle's room sat at the end of the corridor. Voices drifted out from behind the open door. A woman's voice, soft, natural, without the slightest trace of strain, was telling a whimsical story about a giant sunflower that allegedly grew overnight and touched the shop's ceiling, making Walt believe the store had been blessed by a flower fairy. Corbin stopped at the doorway, and he saw exactly what the camera had shown him. But this time it was closer, more real, and 100 times more painful. Sadie Brennan was sitting on the carpet in Noelle's room, cross-legged, surrounded by flowers arranged into butterflies and stars, simple shapes, but placed carefully, as if every petal had its own rightful place. Noelle sat across from her, her legs tucked in, her body leaning slightly forward, her right hand lightly touching a daisy petal on the carpet. She wasn't looking at the flowers. She was looking at Sadie, and on that small face was something Corbin had thought he would never see again. Attention. Not a smile, not laughter, just eyes that were truly looking at another human being instead of staring through them. And that was enough to make Corbin feel as if someone had wrapped a bare hand around his chest and squeezed. "What are you doing in my daughter's room?" Corbin's voice cut through the room like a blade. Cold, even, never raised. Exactly the kind of whisper the entire Chicago underworld knew was more dangerous than any shout. Sadie startled and looked up. The smile on her lips disappeared at once. She saw Corbin standing in the doorway, his back straight, his shoulders broad, his eyes dark, and the instinct of someone who had lived in fear throughout her childhood told her that this man was dangerous. She stood up, wiping her hands quickly against her pants. "I delivered the flowers, and she came looking for me on her own. Corbin didn't let her finish. He turned toward the hallway, his voice still low but sharp as steel. "Get in here." 2 bodyguards appeared in the doorway within seconds, large, cold-faced, their hands already resting near their hips. "Take her outside." Sadie stepped back, her heart hammering wildly. She had known this house wasn't normal, had known it from the steel gates, the cameras, the large men standing at every corner. But now, standing before Corbin Valetti and his 2 guards, she finally understood where she was. One guard stepped forward, lifting his hand to grab Sadie's arm. But before that large hand could touch her, another pair of hands grabbed Sadie first. Noelle's hands. Tiny, pale fingers clutched the leg of Sadie's pants with a strength no one would have expected from a 5-year-old child. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She only held on, and lifted her face to look at Corbin with wide eyes. In those eyes was something Corbin hadn't seen in 8 months. Pleading, not fear, not the usual emptiness. A plea so clear it needed no words at all. "Don't take her away." Corbin froze. His feet seemed nailed to the floor. His hands hung useless at his sides. He looked at his daughter clutching a stranger's pants. looked at those tiny fingers squeezing until the knuckles went white, and realized this was the first time in 8 months Noelle had actively tried to keep someone from leaving. Not him, not any of the nannies, but the flower delivery girl he had been about to throw out of his house. Something sharp drove through Corbin's chest. Not anger, not entirely jealousy, but an emotion without a name, bitter and burning, as he watched his daughter choose to cling to a stranger instead of her own father. Corbin swallowed. He looked at the 2 guards. Out. The 2 men withdrew immediately. Then Corbin looked back at Sadie, his eyes still cold, but his voice trembled slightly at the end of the sentence. A small detail perhaps only Sadie noticed, because she had learned from a very young age how to read fear hidden behind anger. "You're never allowed to come back here again." Sadie looked at him. Then she looked down at Noelle. The little girl was still gripping her pants, her eyes still on her father, waiting to see who would win. Sadie knelt down, gently, and loosened each of the child's fingers from the fabric. She held that small hand in her palm for 1 second, then set it down, meeting the little girl at eye level, and whispered, "I'll send you flowers, okay?" Then Sadie stood and walked out of the room. She didn't look back at Corbin. She didn't say another word. Her steps were quick, her shoulders straight, but her hands were shaking. Noelle watched Sadie until her figure disappeared beyond the door. Then the little girl turned back to look at Corbin. Just for an instant. A brief, silent look, without accusation, without anger, but emptier than any charge could have been. Then Noelle turned her back on her father. She dragged herself, step by slow step, toward the window, sat down in her familiar corner, pressed her face to the glass, and looked outside. As if Corbin didn't exist in that room, as if he had never entered it at all. In the days that followed, the Lake Forest mansion sank into a silence heavier than before. Noelle no longer sat by the window looking outside. She curled up on her bed, her face buried in her stuffed bear, refusing to sit up, refusing to eat. The plates of food Nina placed on the nightstand at every meal remained untouched when they were taken away. Cold rice, milk left alone, bread gone hard and dry. The little girl's weight dropped visibly in less than 2 weeks. Her face grew more hollow, her wrists so small they looked as if they might break if anyone held them too tightly. Dr. Colleen Marsh called Corbin one afternoon, her voice calm, but every word was heavy as stone. "Noelle is seriously regressing, Mr. Valetti. She's shutting herself down completely. Without timely intervention, I'm concerned about her long-term condition, not only psychologically, but physically as well." Corbin ended the call, sat in his office, and opened the camera feed. He saw Noelle's room on the screen. She was curled on the bed, hugging her pillow, her shoulders trembling in small waves. She was crying, but there was no sound, not a single noise coming out of her. Only those shaking shoulders and the tears the camera caught, like tiny streaks of light on her cheeks under the dim night lamp. Then Corbin switched to the hallway camera. Nina was sitting in the chair outside Noelle's room, her back against the wall, her legs crossed, her eyes fixed on her phone screen, her thumb scrolling steadily. Less than 3 meters away from her, behind the half-closed door, a 5-year-old child was crying soundlessly alone in the dark, and Nina either didn't know or didn't care. Corbin turned off the tablet. He sat still for a very long time, long enough for the darkness in the office to swallow the last of the light from the window. Then he picked up the phone and called Nina to his office. Nina walked in, her face calm, with no idea what was about to happen. Corbin didn't invite her to sit. "You have 30 minutes to pack your things and leave this house." Nina blinked. "What? What did I do wrong?" Corbin didn't mention the camera. He didn't explain. He only looked at her, and there was enough in that stare to make Nina instinctively step back half a pace. But she still forced herself to continue. "Mr. Valetti, with all due respect, the child has problems. She doesn't talk, she doesn't eat, she doesn't respond to anyone. Maybe you should consider placing her in a specialized facility, somewhere with people trained to." She didn't finish the sentence. Not because Corbin cut her off, but because he looked at her with the kind of eyes that the men sitting in the meeting room with him the day before would have recognized immediately, the eyes of a man weighing whether someone should be allowed to go on existing. Nina fell silent. She didn't take 30 minutes. She left in 15. After Nina, Corbin contacted 4 nanny placement agencies. No one would accept. The reputation of the Valetti mansion had spread through that circle. No one said it outright, but everyone knew that house belonged to the man all of Chicago didn't dare name outside rooms with closed doors. The last nanny agency to refuse over the phone only said briefly, "I'm sorry, we don't have anyone suitable." Her voice was shaking. Finch stood in the doorway of the office, his arms folded over his chest, silently watching Corbin set the phone down after the fourth call. Then the old man spoke, his voice even, without circling around the truth. "The child only responds to one person, boss, and that person is delivering flowers at your gate every Tuesday." Corbin clenched his teeth. His jaw tightened so hard the sound of his teeth grinding together was almost audible. Everything in him fought against the idea. His instinct for control, the suspicion rooted in his blood, the terror of letting anyone get close to Noelle. But he looked up at the camera screen, still open, saw Noelle curled on her bed, saw the windowsill in her room where the wildflowers Sadie had sent were still lined up, withered and dry, but not a single one thrown away, and he knew Finch was right. Corbin called Sadie to the mansion the next afternoon. She arrived in the old van from Walt's Blooms, walked through the same steel gate she had been thrown out of the last time, past the same two guards who had almost dragged her away, and stood in the cold living room across from Corbin Valetti. Sadie didn't sit down, though. There was an empty chair. She stood straight, her hands clenched around the strap of her purse, her eyes fixed directly on Corbin. "You threw me out, forbade me from coming back, and now you call me here?" Her voice didn't tremble, but that question carried the weight of someone who had spent her whole life being pushed away and pulled back by people with more power than she had. "I'm not something you can use whenever you want and throw away whenever you're done." Corbin stood a few steps away from her, his hands in his pockets, his back straight, his face cold. But when he opened his mouth, his voice no longer sounded like the sharp, icy whisper the entire underworld feared. It was lower, rougher, and at the end of every word, there was a small crack he couldn't hide no matter how hard he tried. "My daughter isn't eating, she isn't sleeping, she isn't looking at anyone." He stopped. "But she lines up your flowers on the window every morning." The room went silent. Sadie looked at him, and for the first time, she saw something behind Corbin Valetti's cold armor. Not weakness, but the exhaustion of a man who had tried to control everything and still couldn't protect the one thing that mattered most. "Why don't you take care of your own child yourself?" Sadie asked. It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't pity either. It was a real question, from someone who truly wanted to know the answer. Corbin looked at her. Then he looked away. He didn't answer. And that silence said more than any explanation he could have given. Sadie stood still for a while. She thought of Noelle sitting by the window waiting for her every Tuesday. She thought of the little girl's eyes looking up at her when she handed her the daisy, eyes trying to find something to hold on to. She thought of herself at 9 years old, sitting in the corner of the house after her mother died, waiting for someone to come, and no one ever came. "I'll take care of her," Sadie said, "but not because of your money, because she needs someone beside her." Sadie began coming to the Valetti mansion every morning at 7 o'clock, before sunlight even slipped through the oak trees lining the road into Lake Forest. She didn't bring child-raising manuals, didn't bring a treatment plan, didn't bring any theory at all. She only brought flowers. Every morning, Sadie sat on the floor of Noelle's room, cross-legged, placed a small bouquet in front of her, and began arranging them into simple shapes on the carpet. She told stories, not fairy tales or children's stories from books, but real stories. Stories about Walt, about how the silver-haired veteran spent 3 hours trying to converse with a lifelike plastic parrot, a delivery man left behind, about a frantic groom who forgot the bridal bouquet on his wedding day and sprinted into the shop in his full tuxedo, and about the neighborhood kids who left handwritten letters in the shop's mailbox addressed to the Flower Kingdom. Sadie talked, and Noelle didn't react. The little girl sat on the bed or in the corner by the window, hugging her stuffed bear, not looking at Sadie, not nodding, not making any gesture that showed she was listening. But Sadie didn't stop. She didn't force Noelle to respond. She didn't ask, "Can you hear me?" Didn't ask, "Do you want to say anything?" She was simply there, sitting on the floor, telling stories to the empty space, and letting Noelle decide for herself when she wanted to step into that space. During those first days, Sadie watched and remembered. She noticed that Noelle always chose the yellow flower before any other. When Sadie arranged flowers on the carpet, the little girl didn't look at the red flowers, didn't look at the white ones, but her eyes stopped on the yellow flowers, only for a moment, just long enough for Sadie to notice. She noticed that Noelle startled every time there was a loud noise, the sound of a door slamming shut, the sound of a guard speaking too loudly in the hallway, the sound of dishes clattering against each other in the kitchen. Each time it happened, the little girl folded into herself, her shoulders shrinking down, her hands gripping the stuffed bear tightly, her eyes wide as she looked toward the bedroom door. The aftermath of that night, when gunshots had exploded through the car window, was still alive inside her body. And she noticed that Noelle liked the scent of lavender. Every time Sadie brought lavender, the little girl didn't touch it, but she leaned toward the flower, breathed in softly, and stayed that way longer than she did with any other kind of flower, as if that fragrance led her to some safe place in memory that Sadie couldn't know. Sadie didn't ask why. She acted. She bought a small yellow tablecloth and placed it on Noelle's nightstand, replacing the cold white cloth that looked like something from a hospital. She spoke more softly, closed doors more softly, walked more softly. She bought a small bottle of lavender oil, and every night before she left, she placed a few drops on Noelle's pillow. No one asked her to do these things. No one paid her extra for them. She did them because she understood that love sometimes wasn't anything grand. Sometimes it was simply knowing what color someone liked, what sounds frightened them, and what scent they liked to breathe in before falling asleep. Then the breakthrough came on a Thursday afternoon, when Sadie wasn't expecting it at all. She was sitting on the carpet, scribbling with crayons, a box of crayons she had bought at a dollar store on her way to work that morning. She drew a flower, deliberately drawing it badly, its petals crooked, its stem bent, its leaves looking like little saw teeth. She looked at the drawing, tilted her head, then said loudly enough for Noelle to hear, "This one looks more like a chicken than a flower. I draw terribly." Noelle was sitting on the bed, hugging her stuffed bear, her eyes turned toward the window. But when Sadie said that, the little girl turned back. She looked at the drawing. Then she looked at Sadie. Then she looked at the drawing again. Sadie kept drawing, pretending not to notice, but her heart began beating faster. From the corner of her eye, she saw Noelle slide down from the bed. Slowly, the little girl took 2 steps toward the carpet, sat down, and looked at the box of crayons. Then she reached out, picked up a yellow crayon, and drew one trembling curve beside Sadie's flower. It wasn't any clear shape, just one small, short, shaking curve on the paper. But it was the first time in 8 months that Noelle had chosen to pick up something that wasn't her stuffed bear and do something with another person. Sadie looked at that curve. She wanted to cry. She wanted to hug Noelle. She wanted to call someone and scream that the little girl had just held a crayon. But she did none of that. She only looked at the drawing, nodded, and said in the most ordinary voice she could hold steady, "A lot prettier than mine." Then she picked up her own crayon and kept drawing, as if what had just happened was the most normal thing in the world. That night, after Sadie had gone home, Corbin sat in his pitch-black office the way he did every night. He opened the camera feed and rewound the afternoon recording. He saw Sadie drawing. He saw Noelle slide down from the bed. He saw that tiny hand holding the yellow crayon. He saw the trembling curve on the paper. He played that clip again. Then again. A 3rd time. A 4th time. A 5th time. A 6th time. A 7th time. The blue light from the tablet screen shone over the face of Corbin Valetti, the man all of Chicago feared, the man who hadn't shed a tear in front of anyone since the night Penny died. He sat there, alone, in the dark, with his hand covering his face, and no one saw. After that night, something began to change in Corbin Valetti's routine, something even he didn't dare give a name to. He began coming home earlier, not much, only 1 hour earlier, then 2 hours, then 3. He didn't go into Noelle's room. He wasn't ready for that, and perhaps he knew better than anyone that he didn't yet deserve to step through that door. But he stood in the hallway, his back against the wall, only a few steps from Noelle's door, silent, listening. Sadie's voice drifted out through the half-open gap. She was telling Noelle about a rainy autumn afternoon when the shop's old radio suddenly broke down, and Walt, completely out of tune, stood in the middle of the floor, belted out old jazz songs at the top of his lungs, just to keep the flowers amused. Her voice was soft, natural, threaded with her own quiet laughter. Noelle didn't laugh, but she wasn't lying on the bed with her face turned toward the wall anymore. She was sitting on the floor beside Sadie, and that alone was an entirely different world from a few weeks before. Corbin stood in the hallway, listening every night, and he hated himself because what he felt wasn't gratitude, but jealousy. Jealousy toward a 27-year-old flower delivery girl who had nothing but an old van and calloused hands, yet could sit beside his daughter with ease, while he, the man who owned an entire empire, didn't dare cross a doorway. One evening, around the second week after Sadie began taking care of Noelle, Corbin was standing in his usual place outside the hall when Sadie stepped out. She nearly walked straight into him. They looked at each other, less than an arm's length apart, under the pale yellow hallway light. Sadie didn't seem surprised. Maybe she had known he was standing there all along, from the sound of his breathing, the sound of his suit jacket brushing against the wall, or simply from the instinct of someone who had grown up learning to sense the quiet presence of another person nearby. "You can go in," Sadie said softly. Corbin shook his head. "No need." Sadie looked at him for a moment. Then she said, her voice carrying no judgment, no blame, only the truth. "She needs you, not me." Corbin looked at her, looked straight into her eyes, truly seeing Sadie Brennan for the first time. Not with suspicion or control, but as someone who was telling him the truth while the whole world around him only said what he wanted to hear. He didn't answer. He turned away, walked back to his office, and closed the door. But that night, for the first time since he had installed 28 cameras in this house, Corbin Valetti didn't open the tablet. He sat in the dark office, staring at the black screen, and didn't turn it on. Not because he didn't want to watch, but because watching through a screen wasn't enough anymore. It no longer filled the emptiness that grew a little wider every night. The emptiness between him and the door to his daughter's room. The next morning, Corbin didn't leave the house before Noelle woke up the way he did every day. He came down to the kitchen at 6:30, before Sadie even arrived. He poured himself a cup of coffee, set it on the table, then sat in a chair and waited. When Sadie brought Noelle down to the kitchen for breakfast, she stopped in the doorway for a moment when she saw Corbin sitting there. Her eyes blinked quickly, but she said nothing. She led Noelle to the table, placed a plate of toast and a glass of warm milk in front of her, then stepped back toward the sink. Noelle sat in the chair, still holding her stuffed bear. She looked down at the plate of toast. Then she glanced to the right, quickly, timidly, only for a moment, looking at Corbin. Then she lowered her head at once. A few seconds later, she glanced again, quickly, then looked down, as if she was checking whether the man sitting there was real, or only an illusion that would disappear if she looked too long. Corbin sat still. He didn't say anything. He didn't try to start a conversation. He didn't try to smile. He only sat there, his hands around the coffee cup, and let Noelle glance at him as many times as she needed. In the corner of the kitchen, Sadie stood with her back to the father and daughter, pretending to be busy washing a bowl that had already been clean for a long time. She didn't turn around, but her shoulders trembled slightly, and if anyone had been standing close enough, they would have seen that she was smiling. That night, Noelle refused to sleep. She lay on the bed, eyes open, one hand gripping her stuffed bear tightly, staring up at the ceiling. Every time Sadie tucked the blanket around her and stepped toward the door, the little girl sat up abruptly, her eyes following Sadie in panic, as if the closing of that door meant one more person would disappear. Sadie came back, a second time, a third time. In the end, she pulled a chair beside the bed, held Noelle's tiny hand, and sang her a lullaby. Sadie's voice wasn't pretty. She knew that. Her voice was a little hoarse, off rhythm on the high notes, and she didn't remember the full lyrics to any song, so she kept singing the first part over and over, then humming through the rest. But Noelle didn't need a pretty voice. She needed someone to stay long enough for her to believe that she could close her eyes, and, when she opened them again, that person would still be there. Noelle fell asleep about 20 minutes later. Her breathing evened out, and her hand loosened around the stuffed bear. Sadie stood up gently, bent down to fix the little girl's pillow, and pulled the blanket up to her chest. Her hand was smoothing the edge of the pillow when her eyes caught a small red light, blinking steadily behind the picture frame hanging on the wall above the bed. Sadie froze. She looked closer. A wooden frame. Inside it a picture of a beach, the kind of decorative print bought from a furniture store, not a family photograph. And in the lower right corner, between the wooden frame and the wall, a tiny red LED dot blinked in a steady rhythm. A camera. Sadie's heart struck hard once, then began pounding. She set the pillow down carefully and stepped to the opposite wall. The round wall clock had a white face, its second hand moving evenly. She tilted her head, looking into the gap between the clock and the wall. Another LED dot. She turned toward the outlet beside the nightstand, an outlet with nothing plugged into it but with one strange little opening on the top surface. She bent down and looked closely. This time, she didn't need to search for a light. She saw the camera lens clearly, as small as the tip of a ballpoint pen, glinting in the nightlight. 3 cameras, in the bedroom of a 5-year-old child. Sadie stood in the middle of the room, her hands clenched into fists, her chest rising and falling. She thought of every moment in this room over the past few weeks. The time she had changed Noelle's clothes, taken off her dirty shirt, put her in pajamas, washed her face and hands. The time she had sat alone on the floor after Noelle fell asleep, so exhausted that tears slipped out and she didn't even bother wiping them away, crying not because of the little girl, but because of herself, because of the childhood memories Noelle had unknowingly awakened. The times she had sung lullabies in her off-rhythm voice, believing no one could hear. All of it had been recorded. All of it had been sitting on some screen, in the pitch-black office of the man downstairs. Sadie stepped out of Noelle's room and closed the door very gently so the little girl wouldn't wake. Then she went down the stairs, walked along the ground-floor hallway, past a guard standing in the corner without looking at him, and stopped in front of Corbin's office door. She didn't knock. She opened the door. Corbin was sitting behind his desk, blue light from the tablet screen falling across half his face. He looked up, and in that split second, Sadie saw that the image open on the screen was Noelle's bedroom, the angle coming from the picture frame. The bed where the little girl was sleeping shone in plain view. "You installed cameras in the bedroom of a 5-year-old child." Sadie's voice didn't shout. It was low, trembling, and sharper than any scream. "In the room where I change her clothes every day. In the room where I sing her to sleep every night." Corbin stood up. The tablet still glowed on the desk, the image of Noelle's room still shining there, evidence no one could deny. "This is my house," Corbin said, his voice hard, the defensive reflex of a man used to controlling everything. "My child, I have the right." "The right to what?" Sadie cut him off, taking another step into the room. "The right to watch your own child through a screen and never once walk into her room? The right to monitor me like a criminal while I'm the only person willing to sit on the cold floor with your daughter?" Corbin clenched his jaw, the muscle standing out sharply beneath his skin. "You don't understand the world I live in. I don't need to understand your world." Sadie looked straight into his eyes, not backing down, not shaking, even though her heart was beating so hard she could hear every pulse in her ears. "I understand that you're afraid, and I understand that you've turned that fear into a prison." She stopped and drew a breath. "For her, and for you too." The office fell silent after Sadie's words, a silence so heavy that the ticking of the clock on the wall could be heard counting off each second. Corbin stood behind the desk, his hands braced against the wood, looking at Sadie with the eyes of a man trying to hold up the last wall even though it had already cracked everywhere. Sadie didn't wait for him to answer. She turned and walked into the hallway, took the thin coat hanging on the hook beside the kitchen door, pulled it over her shoulders, and headed for the entrance. "I don't live under cameras," she said, without turning back, her voice even, but every word carrying the weight of a decision already made. No one should live like that. Especially not the 5-year-old child sleeping upstairs. Corbin stepped out of the office. He saw Sadie's back, saw her shoulders straight, saw her steps quick and decisive, and something in his chest began to collapse, not slowly, but all at once, like an entire building coming down in a single breath. He recognized that feeling. He had felt it once before, exactly once, on the night he sat in the emergency room, staring at his wife's blood on his hands, and knew that everything was slipping out of his control in a way no strength, no money, no power could stop. Loss of control. Complete loss. "Wait." The word fell from Corbin's mouth before he had time to think. It wasn't the voice of command. It wasn't the voice of the boss all of Chicago feared. It was weak, hoarse, cracked down the middle. The voice of a man standing at the edge of an abyss and realizing that if that door closed, he would lose the last thing keeping his daughter from the dark. Sadie stopped. Her hand was already on the doorknob, but she didn't turn around. "You may not believe me," Corbin said, his voice trembling, and that tremor made him hate himself because he wasn't used to being weak, didn't know how to be weak, and hadn't been allowed to be weak in any room he had entered for the past 20 years. "But I need you to listen." Sadie didn't let go of the doorknob, but she didn't open the door. Corbin swallowed hard. His throat tightened as if someone were gripping it. "My wife was shot right in front of my daughter," he said. 3 gunshots. 2 bullets hit Penny. Right there in the back seat, right beside Noelle. He stopped, drew a breath, but the breath wasn't enough. "Because of me," Those bullets were meant for me. Penny died because of the life I chose." Sadie still stood with her back to him, but her hand on the doorknob loosened. "I installed the cameras because I was afraid," Corbin continued, every word pulled out of him like thorns scraping skin. "Afraid someone would get into this house and take away the last thing I still had. So afraid that I turned the house into a fortress, turned my daughter's room into a cell, and called it protection." He stopped. His voice dropped until it was almost a whisper. "But I was also afraid to walk into my child's room, because every time I look at Noelle, I don't see my daughter. I see Penny collapsed in the back seat. I see blood on a white dress. I hear gunfire, and I know the last face Penny saw wasn't our daughter's face, but mine, the man who dragged her into all of this." Sadie turned around. Slowly, she looked at Corbin Valetti, the man the entire Chicago underworld feared, standing in the middle of his own hallway, his hands hanging at his sides, his shoulders fallen, and trembling. Not trembling from the cold, trembling because the armor he had worn for 8 months had just been stripped away, and underneath it there was nothing but a father slowly dying from guilt. "I know what that feels like too," Sadie said, her voice softer now, no longer as sharp as it had been a few minutes earlier, but not weak either, only true. "My stepfather beat me for 8 years, from the time I was 9 until I was 17. No one saw it, no one asked, no one sat down beside me even once to tell me it wasn't my fault." Corbin looked at her, and for the first time, he didn't see the flower delivery girl, didn't see the hired help, didn't see a threat or a stranger. He saw someone carrying scars like his, only she didn't hide them behind 40 bodyguards and 28 cameras. "Noelle is believing that too," Sadie said, looking straight into his eyes. "She's believing that she isn't worth anyone caring about. Every day you don't walk into her room, she believes it a little more. Every night you watch her through a camera, instead of sitting beside her, she loses another piece of herself. And one day there won't be anything left to lose." Corbin felt his chest tighten until he could barely breathe. "I don't know how to be a father," he said, his voice breaking completely. Penny knew how. Penny always knew how. She knew when Noelle was sad, knew when she was scared, knew what to say, what to do. "I only knew how to stand beside Penny and follow her lead. Without her, I don't know what to do." Sadie looked at him for a long time. Then she said, slowly, one word at a time, "You don't need to know how. You just need to sit down." Corbin was silent. "Take the cameras down," Sadie said, her voice gentle but unwavering. "Not because of me, because Noelle deserves a home, not a prison." The next morning, for the first time in 8 months, Corbin Valetti didn't leave the house before dawn. He didn't call Finch. He didn't open his phone to read reports. He didn't sit in the leather chair inside his pitch-black office to review the footage from the night before. He stood outside Noelle's room, his back against the hallway wall, in the exact place where he had stood so many times over the past weeks, to listen to Sadie talk to his daughter. The only difference was that this morning, he wasn't standing there to listen. He was standing there because he didn't know how to go in. Inside the room, Sadie was sitting on the floor with Noelle the way she did every morning. She was arranging a few flowers on the carpet, quietly telling something Corbin couldn't quite hear, her voice soft and steady as always. Then Sadie looked up. She looked toward the bedroom door, which had been left slightly open, and through the narrow gap, she saw Corbin standing there. The two of them looked at each other. Sadie didn't say, "You can go in," the way she had before. She didn't say anything at all. She only gave a small nod, so slight it was almost invisible, then stood, picked up a few fallen flowers from the carpet, and walked out of the room. When she passed Corbin at the door, she didn't stop, didn't look at him, only moved past him quietly, leaving the room to father and daughter. Corbin stood on the threshold. In front of him was his daughter's bedroom, the room he had only seen through a tablet screen for the past 8 months. The yellow tablecloth Sadie had bought lay on the nightstand. The dried flowers were lined up on the windowsill, withered but still intact, each one marking a time Sadie had sent a flower through the gate. The crayon drawing was taped to the wall, Sadie's crooked flower, and Noelle's trembling curve lying side by side on the white paper. And Noelle was sitting on the floor, among the petals Sadie had left unfinished, her stuffed bear in her lap, her eyes lifted toward Corbin. Those eyes were no longer empty the way they had been for 8 months, but they weren't happy either. They were frightened. She was used to her father appearing and then disappearing, passing like a shadow at the doorway, before vanishing down the hall, near enough for her to see but never near enough for her to touch. And now her father was standing there, right in front of her, and she didn't know whether to believe it or prepare for the next disappearance. Corbin stepped into the room. 1 step, 2 steps. His legs felt heavy, as if filled with lead. Every instinct in him told him to turn away, return to the office, open the camera feed, and watch from a distance, from the safe place where he wouldn't have to look into his daughter's eyes and see Penny looking back. He stood in the middle of the room, rigid, not knowing what to do next. Then he looked down at the floor, at the place on the carpet in front of Noelle, the place where Sadie had sat every day for weeks, the place where Sadie had lowered herself to the floor to meet the child at eye level the first time they met in the kitchen, the place where no nanny before her had been willing to sit, because sitting on the floor got your pants dirty, because sitting on the floor made your back ache, because no one paid extra for sitting on the floor. And in Corbin's mind, Sadie's voice echoed, clear as if she were standing right behind him. "You don't need to know how. You just need to sit down." Corbin knelt. Slowly, his right knee touched the floor first, then his left, awkwardly, stiffly, the body of a man who had never knelt before anyone in his life, not even at his wife's grave. Then he sat down on the carpet, folding his legs beneath him, his back slightly bent, his hands resting on his thighs because he didn't know where else to put them. For the first time in 8 months, Corbin Valetti sat at his daughter's eye level. Noelle looked at him. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, as if she was afraid that if she blinked, her father would disappear. She looked at him for a long time, so long that Corbin felt each second stretch into an hour, and in that silence, he could hear every frantic beat of his own heart inside his chest. Corbin looked around, searching for something, anything, to fill the space he didn't know how to fill with words. His eyes stopped on the windowsill, on the neat row of dried flowers, and he picked up a wilted daisy that had fallen onto the carpet. Its stem was brittle, its petals curled dry, but it still held its original shape. He placed the flower in front of Noelle. He said nothing. He didn't know what to say. The silence lengthened. Then Noelle bent down, reached toward the windowsill, picked up another dried daisy, smaller, more withered, and placed it beside her father's flower. 2 daisies lay side by side on the carpet, one placed by the father, one placed by the child. Both were withered, both were still there. Then Noelle leaned forward, small, slow, little by little, as if she was crossing 8 months of distance with a single movement. She rested her head against Corbin's thigh. She didn't speak, she didn't cry, she only rested there, lightly, warmly. Her soft hair touched the fabric of his pants, and the weight of that tiny head on his thigh was lighter than anything in the world, yet heavier than everything he had ever carried. Corbin's tears fell. Not the kind of crying from the night in the dark office. The kind with his hand covering his face. The kind he hid. The kind no one was allowed to see. This time, the tears simply fell, running down his cheeks, dropping onto his daughter's hair, and he didn't wipe them away. He didn't turn his face aside. He sat there on the floor of his daughter's room, his hands unsure of where to go, until finally, he placed them gently on Noelle's back, awkward, trembling, but there. Outside in the hallway, Sadie stood a few steps from the bedroom door, her back against the wall, in the exact place where Corbin had stood on so many nights. She didn't look into the room. She didn't need to look. She heard the silence inside. A silence that was no longer heavy, but soft, warm, as if that room had just breathed for the first time in 8 months. Sadie lifted a hand to wipe her eyes, quickly, then turned and walked quietly down to the kitchen. That afternoon, Corbin called Finch up to his office and said only one sentence. Remove every camera inside the house. Keep the outside system, the gate, the yard, the fence, the garage. But inside, all of them, take them all down. Finch stood still for a moment, his 52-year-old face carved with the marks of time, showing nothing. Then he asked, not in objection, only to be certain. All of them? All of them. Noelle's bedroom, the kitchen, the living room, the hallways, everywhere. Finch nodded. I understand, boss. If I can't trust the people inside my own house, Corbin said, his voice low, then cameras won't save me either. 28 cameras were removed in one night. The tiny holes in the walls were patched. The picture frames were hung back in their proper places. But now they held only pictures. The clock was only a clock. The outlet was only an outlet. The first night without cameras, Corbin sat in his office, staring at the dark tablet on the desk, and felt exposed. Not afraid. It was the feeling of standing under the open sky with no roof above him. The first time in 8 months, he didn't have 28 electronic eyes giving him the illusion that he was in control. But he didn't put them back. In the weeks that followed, life inside the Lake Forest mansion changed in a way no camera could ever have recorded. Every morning, Corbin sat at the kitchen table before Sadie brought Noel down for breakfast. Toast, warm milk, a cup of black coffee for him. Nothing special, but his presence at that table, steady, every morning, was what Noel needed more than any food. She still glanced at her father during breakfast, quickly, timidly. But the gaps between those little glances grew shorter, and by the second week, she no longer needed to check. She knew her father would be there. In the evenings, after coming home from work, Corbin began sitting on the floor in Noel's room beside Sadie, listening to her stories. At first, he only sat in silence, his back straight, his shoulders stiff, looking like a man in a suit sitting on the floor of a child's room with no idea what to do with his hands or legs. But little by little, he began to join in. The first time he said anything to Noel that wasn't an order or a medical question was when Sadie was telling a story about Walt and Dusty the cat. Corbin said without thinking, "If he says he hates cats but named it, then he clearly likes it." Sadie turned to look at him, a little surprised. Noel turned to look too, and for one brief moment, the room held something it had never held before. The voice of a father. Noel began to improve, not the kind of improvement you see in movies. Not suddenly talking and laughing as if nothing had ever happened. It was made of changes so small only someone beside her every day would notice. She began making sounds, not words, only soft little hums when Sadie handed her flowers to smell. A breath that almost sounded like a swallowed laugh when Corbin tried to draw with crayons and drew even worse than Sadie. She began to walk, a few steps at a time, holding Sadie's hand, her legs trembling, but she walked, from the bed to the window, from the window to the bedroom door, from the bedroom door into the hallway. Dr. Colleen Marsh called Corbin after the monthly checkup, and for the first time, her voice wasn't heavy. "This is significant progress. She's coming back." And then there were moments that didn't belong to Noel, moments Corbin hadn't planned for, and Sadie didn't allow herself to think about, but they happened anyway. Quietly, wordlessly, and undeniably. Late one evening, Corbin came home and went up to Noel's room by his new habit. The door was slightly open. The little girl was asleep, the blanket pulled up to her chest, her stuffed bear in her arms, the faint scent of lavender drifting from her pillow. And in the chair beside the bed, Sadie sat dozing, her head tilted to one side, her hand resting on Noel's back, still holding the same position from the moment the child had drifted into sleep. Corbin stood in the doorway and looked. He looked at his daughter sleeping peacefully. He looked at Sadie's hand on the little girl's back, protecting her even inside Sadie's own sleep. He took the thin blanket draped over the back of the sofa in the corner, stepped closer, and placed it over Sadie's shoulders. Gently. His hand trembled when the edge of the blanket touched her shoulder, and he pulled it back quickly, as if he had just touched something that could burn him. Sadie didn't open her eyes, but she was awake. She felt the blanket settle over her shoulders, felt the brief warmth from that trembling hand, and she stayed exactly as she was, eyes closed, breathing even, pretending to sleep because she didn't know what to do with that moment, because she knew who Corbin Valetti was. She knew the world he lived in swallowed every soft thing whole. She knew the last woman who had loved this man had died in the backseat of a car because of 3 bullets that hadn't been meant for her. And Sadie Brennan, who had survived on her own since she was 17 by never letting herself depend on anyone, had no intention of becoming the next one. 3 days later, Finch placed a brown envelope on Corbin's desk. Inside were 5 photographs. Sadie carrying a tray of food at the diner near Wrigleyville. Sadie opening the van door in front of Walt's Blooms. Sadie stepping into her small rented room in Uptown, keys in hand, her back turned to the camera. Every photo had been taken from a distance, from a hidden angle, with a long lens, the kind of photos taken by someone who knew how to follow a person professionally. There was no message attached. There didn't need to be. Segretti wanted Corbin to know that he knew. He knew who this girl was. He knew she came to the Valetti house every day. He knew she mattered. Corbin looked at the 5 photos, and his blood began to boil in a way he had felt only once before in his life, on the night he sat in the emergency room and swore he would burn down everything Segretti owned. But this time, beneath the rage, there was something else, something new. Fear. Not fear for himself. Fear for Sadie. Corbin ordered Finch to place men on Sadie around the clock without her knowing. A car followed her van every morning. Someone watched her room every night. Her van was swept for tracking devices every week. All of it in secret, because if Sadie knew, she would leave, and this time he knew she wouldn't come back. But every night, when he sat on the floor of Noelle's room listening to Sadie tell stories to the little girl, Corbin looked at her and thought of the 5 photos in his desk drawer. Keeping Sadie close meant pulling her into Segretti's line of fire. Pushing her away meant losing her, and Noelle losing her too. In his head, Penny's voice came back to him, his wife's voice from an old argument long ago, when Penny had discovered that he had secretly sent guards to follow her. You can't protect everyone by pushing them away, Corbin. At some point, you have to choose between control and love. He hadn't listened to Penny then, and Penny had died. The call came at 4 a.m. Finch, Waltz Bloom's flower shop in Lincoln Square, burned to the ground. The fire broke out at 2 o'clock. Firefighters arrived at 2:15, but they couldn't save anything. The entire shop, the merchandise, the cold storage, the van, all gone. Corbin sat on the edge of the bed in the dark, the phone pressed to his ear, and he didn't need Finch to say more to know who was behind it. The old man who owns the shop? Corbin asked. At home, no one was hurt. The arson happened after the shop had closed. Exactly Segretti's style. Don't kill anyone. Just burn down the thing they love most and leave them alive long enough to look at the ashes. That was how the old man sent a message. Not with bullets, but with fire. Not with death, but with loss. So the person receiving it would understand that next time, it wouldn't be only a shop. Sadie reached Lincoln Square before the sky had fully lightened. She stood in front of what had once been Walt's Bloom's. The wooden sign Walt had built himself 30 years earlier now. Nothing but a blackened piece of char hanging crooked from a warped iron frame. The peeling blue storefront she had walked past every morning for 4 years was now a dark, hollow mouth stinking of wet ash and burned plastic. Inside, there was nothing left. No flowers, no refrigerator, no old radio playing music every morning, no cup of coffee Walt left ready for her on the counter. 30 years Walt had built it, cutting flowers every day with his calloused hands, paying the rent on time every month, surviving one more Chicago winter each year without closing his doors. All of it turned to ash in less than 2 hours. Sadie sank to her knees on the sidewalk, not because she wanted to kneel, because her legs couldn't hold her anymore. She picked up a half-burned piece of wood at her feet, turned it over and over in her hands, and she knew. She knew this fire wasn't faulty wiring. It wasn't an accident, because the shop had never had any problem in 4 years. And then suddenly it burned to the ground right when she had begun walking into a Mafia boss's house every day. She thought of the photographs she didn't know had been taken, of long lenses watching her from across the street, and she understood that this fire hadn't been aimed at Walt. It had been aimed at her, or more precisely, it had been aimed at Corbin, through her. Walt arrived 15 minutes after she did. The 64-year-old man stood on the sidewalk, looking at the ashes, without saying a word. His eyes were dry. His arms hung at his sides. He stood the way a soldier stands looking at a battlefield after the battle has already been lost, with nothing left to save, nothing left to fight for. Sadie stood beside him, wanting to say something but unable to find any words that were enough. She only placed her hand on his arm, and he placed his hand over hers, and the two of them stood there in the gray light of a Chicago dawn, looking at the only thing that had tied them together turn to ash. Sadie reached the Valetti mansion at 8 a.m. She didn't use the side entrance the way she did every day. She went straight to the front door, walked past 2 guards without stopping, and went directly to the living room, where Corbin was standing beside the window, his face turned toward the yard. He turned around when he heard her footsteps. Sadie stood there, her hair still carrying the smell of smoke, her eyes red but dry, her hands clenched at her sides. Her voice was calm in a way that was frightening, the kind of calm that belongs to someone who has cried every tear before arriving. You know who burned the shop? It wasn't a question. Corbin looked at her. I know. Because of me, Sadie said. Because I'm here. Because I'm connected to you. Corbin didn't deny it, because denying it now would have been an insult to her. I'll leave, Sadie said, her voice not trembling, but her eyes growing redder. Because if I stay, the next person hurt won't be a shop. It'll be Walt, or worse. Corbin took 1 step toward her. I'll handle Segretti. How? Sadie looked straight into his eyes. Kill him? Then someone else will take his place. Then someone after that. Then one night, someone will be sitting in a car with your daughter again, and 3 gunshots will go off again. Corbin went rigid. You want to protect Noelle, Sadie said, and this time the tears fell. Not tears of fear, but the tears of someone who had seen the truth so clearly that it cut through every hope. But you can't protect her by living the kind of life that means she always has to be protected. The sentence fell into the room like a bullet, precise, piercing, and striking the exact place no armor could cover. Corbin Valetti stood in the middle of his own living room, silent, for a very long time. So long that Sadie thought he might never speak again. Sadie left the mansion that morning without looking back. Corbin stood in the living room and watched her disappear beyond the steel gate, and the silence she left behind was heavier than any accusation he had ever heard. He stood there for a long time, looking out at the yard, looking at the closed gate, looking at the road where the old van was no longer parked, and Sadie's words kept circling in his head like a bullet that couldn't find its way out. You can't protect her by living the kind of life that means she always has to be protected. Then he thought of Penny. Not Penny in the back seat that night, not Penny in the coffin, but Penny alive, Penny laughing, Penny standing in the kitchen of their old apartment before there was a mansion, before there were 40 bodyguards, before the Empire swallowed everything, speaking to him in the voice only she had ever dared to use with Corbin Valetti. You can't protect everyone by pushing them away. At some point, you have to choose between control and love. He hadn't chosen, and Penny had died. Corbin picked up the phone and called Finch. The old man answered after one ring. Contact the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Corbin said, his voice even, cold, clear, the voice of a man who had decided and had nothing left to discuss. My network, all of it, territory, warehouses, accounts, lists. I want a deal. Silence on the other end of the line. Long, heavy. Then Finch spoke, his voice lower now. Boss, you understand what you're saying, don't you? You'll lose everything. The empire, the money, the power, the identity. Everything you've built for 20 years. I already lost everything, Finch, Corbin said. 8 months ago, in that car. It just took me too long to realize it. He stopped. The only thing I have left is Noelle, and I can't keep her if I stay this man. Finch was silent for a while longer. Then he said, his voice hoarse. I understand, boss. Don't call me boss anymore. The weeks that followed moved quickly and quietly, the way the underworld operates, without noise, without drama, only meetings behind closed doors, stacks of documents changing hands, recorded statements given in windowless rooms. Corbin Valetti became a federal witness against Omar Segretti and the entire network he had once run. He handed over everything: evidence, territory, routes, bank accounts in 4 states, names of people even the Federal Bureau of Investigation had never heard before. In return, witness protection for him and Noelle, new identities, a new life, and the promise that Segretti would never walk out of federal prison. Corbin lost his empire in 3 weeks, lost his money, lost his power, lost the name all of Chicago feared, lost the Lake Forest mansion with 40 bodyguards and a steel gate, lost everything he had built for 20 years. And strangely, the part that hurt him most wasn't losing the empire, but knowing that he was about to take Noelle away from the place where, for the first time in 8 months, she had begun to heal, the place with the windowsill lined with dried flowers, the yellow cloth on the nightstand, the scent of lavender on the pillow, all the small things Sadie Brennan had placed inside that room with her calloused hands and her broken heart. On the last day before entering witness protection, Corbin met Sadie, not at the mansion, because the mansion no longer belonged to him, at a small cafe outside Chicago, where, for the first time, the two of them sat across from each other at an ordinary table, like 2 ordinary people. No bodyguards, no cameras, no steel gate between them. Noelle sat in Corbin's lap, her head resting against her father's chest, her arms around her stuffed bear. She had grown used to sitting in her father's lap, used to his warmth, used to the sound of his heartbeat beneath his shirt, and that familiarity was the most precious thing Corbin had gained in the past 9 months. Corbin looked at Sadie sitting across from him, her brown eyes still carrying the redness of someone who had cried through too many nights, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee she didn't drink. And he said, "You saved my daughter." Then he stopped, swallowed, and added, "You saved me too." Sadie smiled, a crooked kind of smile, tears rising but not falling. "I only delivered flowers. No, Corbin said, his voice rough. You sat down on the floor. The two of them looked at each other across the small table, and between them were too many things left unsaid. Too many things that couldn't be said because circumstances wouldn't allow it, because time wouldn't allow it, because the life Corbin was leaving behind, and the life Sadie had to keep living, did not meet at any point except this one moment. Then Noelle shifted in her father's lap. She lifted her head, looked at Sadie, and reached into the pocket of her small coat. She pulled out a flower, a dried daisy, its stem brittle, its petals curled, long since withered but still holding its shape. The first flower Sadie had ever sent through the mansion gate. The flower Noelle had kept on the windowsill for months, kept under her pillow every night, and carried with her when she left that house that morning. Noelle held the flower out to Sadie, and she spoke. Her voice was small, hoarse, trembling, so slow that every word seemed to have to cross 8 months of silence before it could escape her mouth. Flower, for, you. 3 words, 2.5 words, really, but they broke everything. Sadie lifted her hand to cover her mouth. Tears spilled through her fingers, ran down her wrist, and fell onto the table. She couldn't hold them back. She had held them in for weeks, held them in inside Noelle's room, held them in front of Corbin, held them in when she found the cameras, held them in when she looked at Walt's shop burned to the ground. But those 3 words broke every wall she had ever built. Corbin held Noelle tighter, his face lowering into his daughter's hair, and his tears fell onto her soft hair, just like they had on the morning he first sat on the floor of her room. The only difference was that this time, he didn't need to hide, didn't need to turn his face away, didn't need to pretend to be strong in front of anyone. The 3 of them sat in that small cafe outside Chicago, crying, and no one in the cafe understood why. No one knew that the man crying had once been the person the entire city feared. No one knew that the girl covering her face as she cried had once been the child no one saw. And no one knew that the 3 words that had just come from the mouth of that 5-year-old girl were the most beautiful and most painful sound both adults had ever heard in their lives. 1 year later, in a small town in western Montana, whose name only appeared after you zoomed in on Google Maps 3 times, there was a wooden house at the end of a dirt road, with a white fence painted unevenly, and a front yard filled with wildflowers growing in messy clusters, not in any neat rows, the kind of garden no one designed, where the flowers were simply allowed to grow wherever they chose. Corbin Valetti, or more precisely the new name the Federal Witness Protection Program had given him, lived there. He worked as a carpenter. He built tables, chairs, and bookshelves for neighbors who knew nothing about his past except that he was a quiet, single father who had moved in from the East. Every week, he drove 40 minutes to the nearest town to see a therapist, sat on the sofa in the small clinic, and talked about things that 1 year earlier he would rather have died than admit. About Penny, about that night, about the gunshots he still heard whenever the rain came down hard, about the guilt he knew would never disappear completely, but that he was learning to live with instead of running from. He still woke in the middle of the night. He still dreamed of Penny. There were still mornings when getting out of bed felt so heavy that he had to lie there for another 10 minutes, staring up at the ceiling, before he could stand. But every morning, he did stand, because every morning, in the room next to his, there was the sound of small feet running across the wooden floor. Noelle was 6 years old now, her brown hair longer, her face less thin, and her laughter rang through the little wooden house in a way the Lake Forest mansion, with all its luxury, had never once heard. She spoke more, not the way other 6-year-old children spoke. She was still quiet, still loved silence, still had days when she withdrew into herself and hugged her stuffed bear while looking out the window. But she spoke. She called for her father. She told him about the butterfly she had seen in the garden. She asked him what they were having for dinner. Sentences so ordinary they could have seemed small, but each one was a miracle to a father who had once watched his daughter through cameras for 8 months and hadn't dared to step into her room. She still kept the dried daisy beneath her pillow. Every night, the first flower, the flower from the mansion gate, the flower a delivery girl had sent to a little girl at the window, without knowing that such a small flower would change everything. One late spring afternoon, Corbin was sitting on the porch reading a book, or really, holding a book while watching Noelle run through the garden chasing a yellow butterfly, when he heard a vehicle, an old engine, slightly rough, the sound of a van that had driven far too many miles. He looked toward the dirt road. A small van stopped in front of the white fence, painted pale blue, with a hand-drawn logo on its side, a flower, and the name of a small flower shop he didn't recognize. The door opened. Sadie Brennan stepped out. Her hair was still messy. Her apron was stained with soil. Her arms held a bucket of fresh flowers full of color, and she stood there before the white fence, in the middle of that Montana dirt road, looking at the little wooden house whose address she had received 3 months earlier in an unsigned envelope sent to her new rented room in Chicago. No message, no phone number, only an address written by hand on a piece of white paper, and she recognized the handwriting. After the Segretti case ended, after the old man was sentenced and the federal prison doors closed behind him, Corbin had sent that envelope. He had also used the small amount of legal money he had left to help Walt rebuild the flower shop in Lincoln Square, not directly, because he no longer existed under the name Corbin Valetti, but through Finch, the only person who had stayed in contact, the man who quietly transferred the money, hired the contractors, and made sure that when Walt opened the new shop, everything was ready. Sadie spent 3 months looking at that scrap of paper with the address on it, 3 months placing it on her nightstand, staring at it every morning, putting it away, taking it out, putting it away, taking it out. 3 months asking herself whether she dared step into the life of a man who had once been someone an entire city feared. The man whose wife had died because of him. The man whose love might be the most dangerous thing she had ever reached for. But then she thought of Noel, thought of the tiny hand clutching her pant leg, thought of the dried daisy, thought of the 3 words in the cafe, and she drove 14 hours from Chicago to Montana. Noel saw Sadie before Corbin did. She was running in the garden when she stopped, looked toward the fence, and her whole body went still for a moment, as if she couldn't believe her own eyes. Then she ran, truly ran, on the legs she had refused to use 1 year earlier, running through the wildflower garden, through the white fence gate, and straight into Sadie's legs, hugging her tightly, her face pressed into Sadie's knees, her voice ringing out into the quiet Montana afternoon. "Flower lady." Sadie set the bucket of flowers down on the ground, knelt until she was at Noel's eye level, exactly the way she had always done since the first time in the kitchen of the Lake Forest mansion, and held the little girl. Her tears fell onto Noel's hair, and she didn't wipe them away, because she had learned from that house that tears weren't something that needed to be hidden. Corbin stood on the porch, still holding the book, watching the 2 of them embrace by the fence. He stood there for a while. Then he set the book down, walked down the steps, crossed the yard, crossed the wildflower garden, and when he reached Sadie and Noel, he didn't remain standing. He sat down, sat right on the grass, at his daughter's eye level, at Sadie's eye level, exactly the way she had taught him in that cold room many months before. The 3 of them sat there, among the wildflowers, beneath the endless Montana sky, where there were no steel gates, no cameras, no bodyguards, no empire, only afternoon sunlight, wildflowers, and 3 people learning how to begin again. Noel sat between them, looked at Sadie, looked at Corbin, then did something only a child would think to do. She pulled from her coat pocket the dried daisy she had kept under her pillow for an entire year, and placed it in Sadie's lap. Then she picked a fresh wildflower from the grass beside them, and placed it in Corbin's lap. A dried flower for Sadie, a fresh flower for her father, past and present. Loss and beginning again. Corbin looked at the fresh flower in his hand, then he looked at his daughter. Then he looked at Sadie, and for the first time in a very long time, he wasn't afraid. The story of Corbin, Sadie, and Noel ends here, but what it leaves behind does not. Sometimes in life, we build walls to protect ourselves, only to unknowingly trap ourselves and the people we love inside. Sometimes we watch, control, and hold everything so tightly and call it love. But real love isn't control. It's trust. It's presence. It's the courage to sit down at eye level with the person you love, even when doing so frightens you. And sometimes the person who heals us isn't someone rich or powerful, but simply someone patient enough to stay, sincere enough to tell the truth, and brave enough to sit down on a cold floor beside a hurting child. If this story touched you, if it made you think of someone in your life, a child who needs to be seen, a father who is trying, or even yourself carrying wounds no one has ever sat down to listen to, please press like so more people can hear this story. Share it with someone you think may need it, and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the new stories we bring every day. We would truly love to hear from you. How did this story make you feel? Did it remind you of anything in your real life? Please leave a comment and share with us the feelings from deep inside your heart, because every story you tell in the comments also has the power to heal the people reading it. Thank you for staying here until the very end. We wish all of you watching this video very good health, a joyful life, peaceful days, and hearts filled with love. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.